This webinar is on the newer restricted substances, basically this year. Now, a lot of these restrictions really appeared last year, but they're starting to really come into their own this year. So I'm going to explain them all. So we're going to talk about a lot of things. I'm going to talk about upcoming deadlines to a certain extent right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about our services. Then I'm going to talk about the REACH SVHC update in January of this year. And then I'm going to take a little diversion and go into EU MDR. I'm going to talk about the ATP 15 update, which impacts products registered, medical device registered after March of this year, and ATP 17, which if new substances, restricted medical devices registered after December of this year. And then a change in the risk profile of ethylene oxide in terms of whether it's even likely new medical devices. Up until now, it's been low risk, but we're seeing more and more suggesting it is not. And then new REACH restrictions, long-chain fluoroalkyl carboxylates, which I've talked about before. I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader groups around them. And then I'm going to talk about a new EU persistent organic pollutant substance. It really isn't a new substance. It's restrictions just changed a bit for articles, so I'll explain that. And then we'll do Q&A. So if you have any questions during or afterwards, feel free to put it in control panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. I have a lot of content today, even though it looks like so much here. I'm going to go deep into the chemistry side at times. It's kind of necessary to explain some of the details, but I'll try to get it all through. I might be going a bit quickly. Of course, everyone who registered will receive a copy of the slides. They'll be recording, and a YouTube version recording you can slow down to sound more normal. Lots of deadlines coming up. I gotta double check all of these, but there's a lot of stuff going on. Medical devices, definitely the ATP 17 update at the end of this year. Prop 65, which I'm not really talking about too much, the new warnings. The warnings went through another consultation. The whole new warning system is pushed back another year. So it'll be mid-2024 for the new warnings. If you're part of our quarterly updates or similar or monthly updates, you'll definitely be hearing lots about that. The ROHS exemption for lead and brass and machined aluminum is, for all intents and purposes, going away. And in our monthlies, we talk about that. But here we're really talking about the new substances. So a lot of what we do, of course, we do a tremendous amount of laboratory testing, and a lot of laboratory testing for us. Also, the test reports focus very much not on the regulation, but the substance list versioning. And there's a lot of list changes coming up. We've tested tens of thousands of products, everything from your chair to your medical device to, electric guitar to, air conditioners and HVAC systems, and a huge variety. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today in restricted materials, we talk about risk assessments. We do benefit heavily from having our own test lab where we can double check ideas. Too much what's out there we're finding is really armchair stuff, where people sitting at a desk or just doing research online or whatever, put out risks. And we see, definitely when we look at a new substance and where it's used, you can literally see the copy paste among different government organizations. They just literally copy paste, used in textiles, and wood. And the same sentences are repeated over and over again, which is great. But we have a test lab that allows us to look more in detail, so be much more specific, and also confirm or disprove some of the assumptions. Regulatory, if you like what we do here, quarterly updates are strongly recommended. It's only a couple thousand a year. Probably easily the best way to stay up to date. We do this for 80 to 100 companies. We sit down every quarter and we explain what's changed in the regulation, but explain it to you and your stakeholders. We talk about what you want to talk about and how it applies to your product or doesn't apply. There's some things that look like they apply to your product but don't. Definitely in our space, there's a lot of fear out there at times. We try to get you to buy things. We try to explain everything. As part of the quarterly update service, you'll also get risk assessments, these single pagers that provide reference on the new substances. So for example, a whole bunch of new substances were in ATP 15 for medical device. Here is the risk of being in any of your products above 1,000 ppm. And if there's a risk, not that they are, but the risk, this is the material types of risk. One of the things we find very hard in this industry is proving a negative, proving something does not exist. It's relatively easy to prove something does exist. We test for it and find it, it does exist. But proving it doesn't exist, just because we didn't find it this time, doesn't mean it isn't there. It's a much harder thing. So the risk assessment provide at least a tangible document, say this is the new substance, it's low risk in our products because of this, and that's why we are or are not doing anything related to it. Those are part of our quarterly update services, but separate to that, outside of quarterly updates, we do also a lot of opinions for people. I've been in non-compliance for ROHS. What's the risk profile and what do I have to do with it? Is my product a large-scale industrial or a large-scale fixed installation for ROHS, etc.? What do I really have to do? Here's my product. Here are all the countries I sell into. What do I have to comply to? So we do a tremendous amount of that. On the risk assessment side, which is part of our quarterly update services, easily recommend. If I was not here part of this company, it was definitely the one service I definitely keep up to speed on. Probably one of the most fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance is the things you're most likely to be non-compliant for are the things you didn't know about. So as part of that also, you get risk assessments for, say, the new substances, say an ATP update, adaptation technical progress update for EU MDR, changes the substance list. Here are the substances, here is how they apply to your products or not. They're low risk and this is why. And it could be MDR, it could be the new SVHCs or the new SVHCs. These are low risk in your products because of this reason. This one's high risk, but it's in these uses. So you're only really worried about these material types. So now to the main material content of the webinar today. There are 4 new REACH SVHCs as of January of this year. There's going to be another one come July, and I'll talk about that at another time. Of these 4, 3 are really low risk. The first one is tris-2-methyl oxoethoxym vinyl silane. It is a monomer for adhesion of mineral filled polymers. What it is a monomer that becomes a polymer to adhere glass to plastic, generally. Now, any of the monomer generally be fully reacted into a polymer, but there might be some trace residual monomer. But in the REACH SVHC, the 1000 ppm limit is over the weight of the article, the component. Any chemical that's governed by safety data sheet does not fall into that until it's added to the physical item. So if this is adhering a piece of glass and a piece of plastic together, any residual monomer in that adhesive is measured over the weight of the adhesive plus the glass piece plus the plastic piece. And at that point in time, the risk of the monomer, residual monomer being over 1000 ppm is virtually nothing. So that's low risk. The third one is a high performance lubricant additive. Any lubricant added to your product, any residual chemical in the lubricant is measured over the weight of the entire product or assembly, and a small additive will be a trivial mass. It won't be around 1000 ppm. And last one, 4-MBC, is a human sunscreen. Not allowed in North America, but it is allowed in the EU. Should not be spread over a large dermal surface, a skin surface. Really low risk for physical products. It's a human sunscreen. So the one that's reasonably high risk is the number 2, 6,6-ditertbutyl 2,2-methyl-cresol, Dbmc, also called antioxidant 2266. Is an antioxidant in lightly colored polymers. It's very similar to bisphenol A. Bisphenol A is 2 phenols. A phenol is a benzene ring, that 6-sided ring there with an OH group attached. These are cresols. Cresols have an extra CH3 or methyl group at the bottom. This is a diprecresol. It's an antioxidant similar to bisphenol A can be. It's got 2 major uses. Its most common use is as an antioxidant in superglues, cyanoacrylates, Loctites. So we used to watch those commercials growing up and somebody would glue their helmet to a girder or something. That's super glue, that's cyanoacrylate. However, it's an adhesive. And for REACH SVHC purposes, any residual antioxidant, which would be a couple thousand ppm in the Loctite, is measured over the weight of the cyanoacrylate and the part it's adhered on to. And if you add the weight of the part it's adhered onto, any residual Dbmc is trivial mass. So it's low risk for REACH SVHC. Now we're going to see the same chemical come up later. It's not low risk for EU MDR because the definitions are different. This one's at the article level. It's at the material in contact level. It's quite different. Now there's also this chemical, Dbmc, is used as an antioxidant lightly colored vulcanized rubber. So white or off-white or transparent isoprene or nitrile rubber or SBR. They have to be lightly colored. A black nitrile rubber with full carbon black does not need an antioxidant the same way that a white one does. So we're looking at antioxidant lightly colored vulcanized rubber. And that's the only situation that it can be over 1000 ppm. And of the 4 SVHCs, this is the only one that's a risk to be declarable. And it can be declarable in a rare situation of being an antioxidant light colored vulcanized rubber. Now you might see in the safety data sheet a lot of a cyanoacrylate you're using. However, any residual Dbmc It's measured over the weight of the adhesive and whatever it's adhered onto, and its residual weight will be well below 1,000 ppm. So for each SVHC, the cyanoacrylate use is low risk. The antioxidant use in vulcanized rubber is rarer, but not low risk. So that's it for the new SVHCs. If you had our quarterly update service, you also have a little sheet, reference sheet for each one that you can use and apply to products or for decisions you make. There are 6 new Proposition 65 substances. So most of them Prop 65, any new change takes into effect 1 year after date of publication, and it applies to the date of manufacturing. So these changes, there's 2 sets of changes, happen in December of 2021. They apply to products manufactured after December 2022. It's always based on the date of manufacture for Prop 65, not the date of import or date of sale. It's the date of manufacture. And so a lot of longer names, and I'll explain what they are. 3 of them are basically the same family. They're acrylates. They're monomers to make acrylics. Acrylic paint for one thing, but also acrylics like PMMA, plexiglass. Not where we see it in physical products. So it's the monomer that will be somewhat residual in the plexiglass or PMMA. PMMA also makes contact lenses and other things. This one is very low risk because it's got such a high exposure threshold in Prop 65, unless it's got long-term exposure, unless it's basically wearable or it's medically invasive. So this one, if you have acrylics, this one's only a problem if it's basically a wearable acrylic or a medically invasive acrylic. 2 Ethylexal Acrylate is of the same family. It's another building block of acrylics. It also has a high exposure threshold. So you're looking at acrylic wearables or medically invasive wearables. This one could theoretically be used in the same things, but generally is not. It could be used as a sealant or UV ink. It's also another acrylic monomer, very rare and not really expected to be a problem in most situations. It's really this one. So if you have a medical device with acrylics and you've done ISO 10993-18 testing, you probably often have seen methyl acrylate in what comes out, and that's pretty typical. Now, do you realize, even though it might be safe for EU MDR, Prop 65 on average is a 10 times stricter limit than EU MDR. EU MDR is 100 times safety limit. Prop 65 is 1,000 time limit. Co-monomer, should just say monomer. Interesting word. This one is THF, tetrahydrofuran. It's an aprotic polar solvent. Aprotic polar solvents are pretty common, NMP, DMF, DMAC. They're all regulated. An aprotic polar solvent is a polar solvent, like water is a polar solvent, or hydrochloric acid is a polar solvent. They're very polar, but they're, unlike water, which the hydrogen helps create the polarity. Hydrogen is a proton, single proton. So it's protic. This is aprotic. Its structure usually around oxygen. It does not require a hydrogen per se for the polarity. It's an aprotic polar solvent. It's used in non-woven fibers to make polyether polyurea copolymers, spandex or lycra or elastane, as is NMP or DMAC. It's just another aprotic polar solvent. It is a high threshold for exposure to Prop 65. So you're really looking at low risk unless it's in wearable spandex or elastane or lycra, which are all just different brand names of the same thing. Polyether polyurea copolymers. It's a trace residual solvent. It doesn't mean spandex has this one. It could have another aprotic polar solvent, it could have NMP, it could have DMAC, but they're all Prop 65 listed. This one is a Pfoa substance. This is a PFOS. It's a sulfonate. It's generally not terribly well regulated in, say, Europe. It's regulated 1,000 parts per million, which is pretty irrelevant because its main use is as a processing aid for fluoropolymers. It'll normally be in the parts per billion or parts per million level, not 1,000 parts per million. So not really a problem in Europe. For here, the PFOS concentration is so low in a product, it really has to be really high exposure. You have to have a detectable amount in a wearable or medically invasive. Where we generally see regulation or prosecutions under Prop 65 for PFOA, which is the very commonly regulated substance. PFOA is already a Prop 65 substance. We see it primarily in things like makeup underlayer, which often has a fluoropolymer to make it silky or smooth. It's Teflon, and it's potential surfactant. And of course, that's wearable. So this is really more of an issue in a wearable fluoropolymer or fluoro coating. Same thing with PFNA. So OA, which is a Prop 65 substance and basically banned in Europe, is perfluorooctanoic acid 8. This is perfluorononoic 9. It's one longer. So when we talk about long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylates, LCPFACs, it's one longer than PFOA. It is a long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylate, which come up a bit again later. Now, it's so low concentration as a residual surfactant, captured in the polymerization. So when you emulsion polymerize, that's how you make PTFE or PVDF. You need a surfactant to break down the barriers between the non-polar, say TFE monomer, and the ammonium persulfonate in the water, which is quite polar, to react and cause the polymer to be formed and polymerize it. So it's trace concentration. It's not part of PFNA. It can be used to make PTFE, but it doesn't have to be. And if it is, it's not supposed to be part of PTFE. It just gets caught up sometimes in the polymerization process. Again, so low concentration, we're only worried about this in a wearable or invasive fluoropolymer. So the new Prop 65 substances, and I'm going to update this in the next version, are only really concerned the ones that go into effect at the end of this year in fabrics, wearables, or medically invasive parts, ones with extended contact or duration. So again, we do lots of lab testing, especially medical devices, and reach SPHCs. We do tons of skip declarations, a lot of experience. And I'm going pretty fast today, but if you're part of our quarterly updates, we sit down with just you and your stakeholders and talk about what you want to talk about. And we'll talk about all the new stuff. We'll also take feedback like, hey, I'd like to learn more about UK REACH or EU packaging or something like that. We roll that in there. Also included other risk assessments where these are the new updates for the REACH SPHC for July of 2022. And this is the substances and whether or not they're at risk at all in your product. And if they are at risk, what materials are they at risk in, being over 1,000 ppm. So on to EU MDR. Now, in the medical device side, EU MDR is kind of odd in the fact that it doesn't control its restricted materials compliance. Its restricted materials compliance, or the substances under scope, are controlled separately. EU MDR under section 10.4 regulates category 1, known to cause carcinogens, mutagens, or reproductive toxins over 1,000 parts per million in a fluid, invasive, or gas contacting path. But what is a category 1 CMR is controlled by the EU classification, labeling, and packaging regulation. That regulation is updated on average once a year, sometimes more. The update to CLP is called the Adaptation to Technical Progress, ATP. And it turns out last year there were 2 substance updates. ATP 15, which happened in 2021, but applies to medical devices registered after March 1st, 2022, and ATP 17, which applies to medical devices registered after December 17th, 2022. Now, there was an ATP 16, but it updated content of the warnings, say for safety data sheets. It didn't change the classification of any particular substances. Now, in the typical one of these updates, there's about 200 or plus substances that get updated. Most of the time, it's changing the warning, say, eye sensitization, or eye irritation, or skin irritation, or flammability. But usually about 15 to 20 of them become classified for the first time as a category 1, known to cause carcinogen or mutagen or reproductive toxin. Once they're Cat 1 CMR, they're regulated under EU MDR. So there's quite a few updates. Most new ones affect substances that can be in, but aren't necessarily, in fluoropolymers, acrylics, polycarbonates, epoxies, and adhesives. Again, we're only concerned about the invasive, fluid, or gas path. One of the big ones, ATP 14, which applied to medical devices after October last year, included cobalt, and that one's quite common, over 1,000 ppm in stainless steel. So medical devices, ATP 15, a lot of substances, a lot of big long names. Some of them look like they'd be common. Diisooctyl phthalate. It's actually extremely uncommon. It's very low risk. What we do see, diisooctyl phthalate is 8. Diisononyl phthalate, which is 9, we see really common as DINP. So DINP is super common. Diisooctyl phthalate, the 8 version, is not. We've been testing it on and off for a long time. We've never really seen it. So of the ones that are risking this one, this is one of them. This is MBIS 23 epoxypropoxybenzene, which is never what it's called. It's called resorcinol diglycidyl ether. It is an epoxide. It's got an epoxide group. That's ethylene oxide in the end. And this is what gives it its hazard rating. It's the ethylene oxide. So ethylene oxide, ETO, is that pyramid or triangle with an oxygen at the top. Looks like a sun coming over the pyramid. All epoxies have it. That's an epoxide. So two-part epoxies always have an epoxide. It has some chemical that has this epoxide group. And that epoxide group is like a hand. And the way the epoxy hardens is the small chemical like this is liquid, but hands will open up and grab hold of other polymers or the other material and create longer chain polymers. And the longer chain are more rigid and solid, and that's hard epoxy. So that epoxide is typical of any two-part epoxy. It's because that is the reactive end. That's also why it's more dangerous. It's got an ethylene oxide type group. It's a category 1B carcinogen. However, most of it will be consumed during use because it's supposed to. It's the whole point of hardening. It binds with other molecules to create much longer polymers, which this is a constituent piece. But it's a new chemical. It'll be a polymer at that point in time. The thing is, on a safety data sheet, which these are relatively common in hard epoxies, bisphenol A epichlorohydrin epoxies, it's often like 30% of the weight of the epoxy. That's 300,000 ppm. Now, most of it will be gone when it hardens, but the chance of being over 1,000 ppm in the remaining hard epoxy is pretty decent. Going from 300,000 ppm to 1,000 is a lot. So it's hard to tell for sure, but it definitely can be over 1,000 ppm in the epoxy. So this is SVHC be less of a problem because any epoxy is a chemical until added to the article, and then any residual amount of this would be measured over the weight of the adhesive and the article it's adhered onto, the component. Not true for MDR, it's material in contact. So it's whether or not it's above this concentration in the epoxy, which is possible because it could be 20 to 30% of the original epoxy hardened. That's an epoxide group. The other one is methyl oxoethyl acrylate. So methyl acrylate is the monomer building block of PMMA. Acrylics or plexiglass, PMMA. This is 2-methyl oxyethyl acrylate. It makes poly 2-methyl oxoethyl acrylate, PMEA. So PMEA is not regular, it's the polymer. It's the residual 2-methyl oxyethyl acrylate left over. And it could be over 1,000 ppm, probably not, but it's possible. Its main use is really medical devices. It's blood compatible. It's an antithrombogenic material. It's quite blood compatible. So this poly PMEA can be used in medical devices. The question is whether or not that polymer has any residual that's monomer over 1,000 ppm. Probably not, but it's a newer regulated material. So right now we have high risk to investigate when we run into that plastic, but we haven't seen it over 1,000 ppm yet. So for ATB 15, which applied in March of this year, there were two substances, of which outside this obscure use in poly 2-methyl oxyl acrylate, you're really looking at bisphenol A based hard epoxies. This one should be, if it's in the hard epoxy, in the safety data sheet. It's already regulated for a lot of reasons. It's quite reactive, and it'll be very high concentration if it's used, and it should be pretty obvious. ATP 17, again, remember there's no 16 because 16 didn't actually change any substance ones, was updated in December this year. Now it's actually an extraordinarily complicated update in some ways that I'm not really going to go into here. If you have the risk assessment, it will explain bits and pieces of it. Because in this case, some of the boric acids, what boric acids or boric oxides are under it changed. And one of the other things is some of the substances like boric acid have always been a category 1 CMR, but they're only a CMR when they're over 4.5%. Now they're a CMR when they're over either 0.3 or 0.1%. This is true for a lot of CMRs. People don't realize. A lot of things people, hey, this chemical is a carcinogen. It's like, no, that chemical is a carcinogen in this situation. For example, most mineral oils are only a carcinogen if they contain PAHs. If they don't contain PAHs, then they're not a carcinogen. So we regulate more the mineral oil and similar materials, in our case, by looking for PAHs, because if the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are not there, then it's not a carcinogen. And so a lot of these have a lot of the same rules, where they're only carcinogen in a certain situation. Anything marked ISO is a ISO standard pesticide name. Those are all crop pesticides. It should be pretty low risk for most physical products. 1,4-dioxane is a trace contaminant from ethylene glycol and a few other materials. The only one really of interest is Dbmc again, 2266-ditertbutylphenol. Now there is one that's very interesting, let's talk about. That's the tetrafluoroethylene in the middle, TFE. I'll explain that one in a bit. So TFE is the building block of PTFE. So PFOA can be used to polymerize this chemical TFE into PTFE, but it's not supposed to be in the PTFE. It just can be, PFOA can be residual contaminant. TFE is the literal building block of PTFE. What happens, that double bond in the middle, it breaks the double bond, and then it connects to another TFE that's broken its double bond, and they bind together, and they create repeating chains of TFE. And what the question is how much residual TFE is left over? Now, on the bright side, it's very, very little, but it's hard to prove for a while. And this would be a problem because a lot of medical devices use PTFE, and if TFE was potentially above 1,000 ppm, that would create a lot of MDR challenges. The thing is, TFE is very reactive with oxygen. It explodes, or dramatically. So in your typical PTFE plastics, polymerization factory or plant, more than half the equipment is around the safety of TFE, where TFE is normally stored with another chemical that keeps it reactive from oxygen. When it's piped through the piping, most of the work is it has to separate the chemical that stops it from reacting with oxygen, and then pipe it into the next reaction chamber without touching oxygen or air. And when it gets piped in, it gets put into water, and the water contains ammonium persulfonate, and that triggers the TFE reaction. And this emulsion polymerization, TFE is a non-polar substance. Water is polar. It needs a surfactant like PFOA. It precipitates out into solid PTFE. The question is how much TFE is left over. Any PFOA in there is just surfactant that got caught up in polymerization. PFOA is the easiest way to control the plastic size and grain structure by modifying it. So what the question is whether or not TFE is above 1,000 ppm. And it is very hard, say, for a lab like us to measure TFE because the control sample is explosive. Fortunately, there's a couple labs that found a way to do it, to keep the TFE from blowing up the lab, which would be dramatic. And they proved that the TFE, normal PTFE, has below detection limits amount of TFE. It's low risk of being 1,000 ppm, and if it was there, it would react directly with oxygen in the first place and not be a problem. So TFE, if it was a problem at 1,000 ppm, would be a problem a lot in medical devices. Turns out it's nowhere near 1,000 ppm, mostly because of its reactivity with oxygen. This one's also low risk. We do talk about it because it has some similarities when we talked about earlier as being high risk. It is another epoxide. An epoxide has that triangle group with the oxygen at the top. It's like a sun coming over a pyramid. That's ethylene oxide. It's again typical of an epoxide or diluent for BPA epichlorohydrin hard epoxies. That triangle basically opens up like a hand, it grabs hold of another hand and creates a permanent longer polymer, and that's the whole point. It usually has two epoxide groups, possibly one, but usually two. It looks like it's fully reactive. Also, when it starts out, unlike the resorcinol diglycerol ether, it doesn't start out at 30% concentration. It starts at a really low concentration. And the chance of the residual unreacted amount being above 1,000 ppm in the hard epoxy is very, very low. So it's quite different than the other one. One epoxide, I was saying it's high risk because it starts at such a high concentration. This one's low risk because it starts at a relatively low concentration before reacting. It's also relatively rare. It's much harder for us to get a hold of a sample of this. Now, this is one we talked earlier. This is Dbmc again, 6,6-ditertbutyl 2,2-methylene P-cresol or 2,2,6,6 antioxidant. It's very common in cyanoacrylate superglues. So different types, say, of Loctite. So some medical Loctites have it, some don't. If you do have it, it reacts a bit with oxygen. This is made, but it generally doesn't react through. It will often be above 1,000 ppm in the Loctite. So if you have a cyanoacrylate in contact with a fluid, gas, or invasive path in a medical device, you have to make sure that it doesn't have Dbmc above 1,000 ppm. It should be in the safety data sheet, but you have to make sure it's not above 1,000 ppm. It's still also an antioxidant, lightly colored of vulcanized neoprene or nitrile rubber or SBR, which can also be in a medical device. We're not talking TPE or silicone. We're just talking the nitrile and butadiene-based rubbers. It can be an antioxidant, lightly colored version to stop it from discoloring when it's extruded or otherwise compounded or manufactured. So this one is high risk in cyanoacrylates. So of the new ATP 17 substances, which apply December this year for medical devices, you're really looking at Dbmc in primarily Loctites, a little bit in antioxidants and lightly colored rubber, but it's mostly a concern in antioxidants, in cyanoacrylates. Again, we do tons of testing, especially medical devices. We're happy to help. We have a process for everything. We get audited all the time. That's one of the nice things about having a lab is we can double check people's assumptions. I love the assumptions about data gathering. It is important to ensure your suppliers know what the parts have to be compliant to. Trusting across the board the data is silly. The human error is too rife. And realistically, if you have a non-compliance, all the national authority cares is whether you test it. That's all they care about. They don't care what your supplier said. It's always my dog ate my breakfast, and they don't care. They really just care whether you've spent the real effort. Maybe you tested and verified it did or did not have things. There always comes down, when we have a non-compliance, it really comes down, do you have a test report? If you're never non-compliant, it doesn't really matter how you did it. But if you're ever non-compliant, it does matter a lot whether you've tested. Regulatory quarterly updates can keep you up to speed a lot more. I went through this a lot very quickly in a way that may or may not be easy to understand. And it wasn't necessarily specific to your product. So what we normally do is talk specifically about your products. Now, also the MDR side, there's two list changes, ATP 15 and 17. There's also been a chemical risk change. A risk change is, up until now, the medical associations and medtech and such have said ethylene oxide is low risk, being over 1,000 ppm in a fluid gas path. And that would be cool, but the data isn't, we're seeing a diversity in the data, and we've had to reprofile internally what we see as a risk. So ethylene oxide is used as a sterilization chemical for medical devices, replaces steam sterilization. But it's also category 1 carcinogen and a category 1 mutagen, and it's a category 1 reproductive toxin. It is the holy trinity of CMRs. And what we see in medical devices, the competing pressure between sterilization efficacy, how well leaves a particular bacterial spore, some kind of brown or black spores, how well it kills the spores, versus how much ethylene oxide it leaves behind in the medical device, which is a carcinogen, among other things. And the question really is, and we do a risk assessment for MDR, can ethylene oxide be above 1,000 ppm in an invasive material? And the current risk profiles up to now has said, no, it can't be. Okay, so one of the first things we were asked last time the question, we double checked literature first. Now literature is anecdotal and nice about a lab, we can double check things. Medical devices are normally allowed up to 4 milligrams per device, if not higher, ETO. Milligram for us means 1,000 ppm. Milligram per gram is 1,000 ppm. Once we see milligrams, we're up in the 1,000 ppm level, where this is regulated for UMDR. In this particular case, it's micrograms over grams. So milligram is 1,000 ppm. Microgram per gram is 1 ppm. So we're seeing results in the 2,500 ppm range. Micrograms over grams is ppm. That's over 1,000 ppm. That easily says there's a risk of ETO being over 1,000 ppm in material. Now, this is 75 durometer flexible polyurethane, which is very high absorbency for ETO, so it's one of the worst case scenarios, like flexible PVC is. This one, though, did have 12 hours of aeration. Theoretically, ETO aerates out. It's a great theory, sort of works, not terribly well, what we're seeing in the data. It'll come out of water, no problem, but air, only a little bit. And it's really dependent on the ETO absorbency of the material. So polyester fabric, for example, is very high ETO absorbency. You get tons of it in there. Now, you won't see a lot of polyester fabric or similar in an invasive path, but it could be. The next highest are flexible PVC or polyurethane in particular. They have 10 to 50 times higher concentration than, say, silicone or PTFE or acrylics. Nylon, by the way, is somewhere in between. So PVC will have 10 times as much ETO in the same device as the silicone. So ETO is normally applied across the device. We normally see it's much higher concentration in flexible PVC or polyurethane. They're much more absorbent to ethylene oxide. Now, we check with the manufacturers, and this one that makes the sterilization machines. They have data publicly available on their website. They're getting ethylene oxide levels in soft PVC over 1,000 ppm. Now, it can be lower, but anything in the hundreds is a risk for, as far as we're concerned, for UMDR, because it could be higher. And if they go over 1,000 like this is, it can be over 1,000. So this is an important thing where we're seeing, you know what, it's been low risk. Everybody's like, hey, we do 10993-7. It's not related. They're the same chemical, but it's milligrams per device. 10.4 is per material in contact. And certain materials have much higher concentrations than others. Also, it's concentration, not based on extraction. It's actually how much is in it. So a key thing to take away is there's a reasonable risk of ETO. Now, ETO has been a CMR for a long time, but it's a reasonable risk being over 1,000 ppm in flexible polyurethane, flexible PVC, fabric, and to a lesser extent nylon in medical devices. So you want to make sure you take care of it. Definitely what we've seen in the past, if you haven't tested properly for it and you make a mistake, the penalties are huge. Now, you won't see ETO often in a gas path. It's not normally approved for gas path usage for a variety of reasons. But this in ETO sterilized parts, it could be in an individual material above 1,000 ppm. Device, maybe not, but individual material. The risk is there. Now that's EU MDR section 10.4, whether it's over 1,000 ppm and need to label and justify it. It's also governed under Prop 65. The EU MDR limit, more or less, is 4 milligrams per device or per day. Prop 65 limit is 2 micrograms per day. It's 2,000 times stricter. Let's just assume if you use ethylene oxide sterilization, you're going to need a Prop 65 warning. You're going to be way above the exposure limit. It's 2,000 times stricter. Prop 65 is generally much stricter than MDR. MDR is generally not terribly strict about limits on substances. So if you're ethylene oxide sterilized, you're pretty well guaranteed to be need a Prop 65 warning. On the bright side, it's a carcinogen and a mutagen, so you can just list just ethylene oxide to cover both. But it is a Prop 65 risk. Your ethylene oxide sterilized, it's pretty guaranteed you're above the daily exposure limit for Prop 65. Medical device, it's a milligram per day. Prop 65, it's micrograms per day. Long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylates. EU POP restricts PFOA. It's 25 parts per billion, which you've seen at some time. The longer versions of PFOA, so PFOA is perfluorooctanoic acid, 8. Nona, which is 9, or longer up to 14, are done under REACH as long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylates. The REACH one governs the long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylates, the length 9 and longer versions of PFOA, but also any chemical that could degrade into PFOA, which opens up a bit of can of worms into photolymers and fluoroacrylates. Adds more substances. So again, generally what's regulated is the carboxylate side. It's the left side. It has to be at least 7 carbon fluorines in a row. PFOA is 7 carbon fluorines plus 1 carbon for the carboxylate, which is why it's octanoic, 8. It's 7 and above for carboxylates. So PFOA and longer is regulated. Now it's really useful for surfactant because one side, the OH, the H pops off, becomes a minus. So by the way, one of the reasons you see lists of like, oh no, there's like 50,000 PFASs. No, there's not. A, most of them are not used. B, many of them are salts of each other. So PFOA like this, where that H is, you can put a sodium on it or a potassium or ammonium. But once you put it in water, that H or sodium or potassium falls off. And it's all the same part. Once we get it, it's all the same material. And the initial one, which is in their list, can be all different. But realistically, once it touches water, they're all the same materials. And that's the polar side, which likes water. And then the nonpolar side, which likes oils, like TFE. That's why it's such a good surfactant. It's like a detergent. One side is very nonpolar, one side's polar. And that's why it's really handy to make PTFE amongst everything else. Now, long chain carboxylates are on the carboxylate group, which might not mean much to stuff, but it looks like that. At the end can be an OH, but the hydrogen can be a sodium, a potassium, an ammonium, a whole bunch of other things. The idea is when you drop it in water, that hydrogen at the far right, or the sodium or the potassium pops off, and it becomes the PFOA ion. This is actually PFNA. It's 1 extra length. Regulated are the linear versions like PFNA, which go in a straight line, or the branch versions like PF37DMOA. It's the bottom right one's generally not used, but it is regulated too. It still meets all the 8 or longer carbons fluorines in a row. So the restriction includes the long chain carboxylates, 9 and longer. 8 PFOA is already regulated elsewhere under POP. They include the branch versions too. But it also includes phototelomers, which are relatively mostly intermediates. Their naming conventions based on the number of carbon fluorines in a row, like 8, and then there's 2 carbon hydrogens. 2, it's an 8,2 photolymer alcohol, FTOH. It's generally a building block intermediate to make acrylics, fluoroacrylates. This is the one we do see. It's a fluoroacrylic. It's got the carbon fluorines. It's got the 2 carbon hydrogens in between, and then it's got an acrylate group. So that's where that methyl acrylate shows up again. Talked about a couple times today. In the methyl acrylate, where it's fluoroacrylic coatings, which we see in circuit boards and some other things. Now, this is not PFOA or even a long chain PFOA, but the substance has been determined to be able to degrade into PFOA. So it's regulated, instead of 25 parts per billion, it's regulated at 260 parts per billion. So that's where this other limit comes from. There's just a couple families of chemicals that can degrade into PFOA. They're instead regulated at 260 parts per billion, not 25. Now the fluoroacrylates, it's in there because it can degrade to PFOA. It can be used as a waterproof coating as a fluoroacrylate. It can be a conformal coating on circuit boards. That's the Novec down below is. Basically, all the 3M Novecs are fluoros of some way, shape, or form. There could be a fluoroether, or in this case, it's a fluoroacrylate. Ultra thin coating. So where do we see the long chain PFACs? Fluoro coatings, because they're usually suspended PTFE or PVDF fluoros in some other material. And PFOA may be used as surfactant or PFNA. Solid fluoropolymers like PTFE or FKM or PVDF, which is like Teflon or Viton or Kynar. There's some comments in the morning one, and we'll use the name brands of it. Well, PTFE, one of the common name brands is Teflon, but it's not the only one. FKM is Viton, PVDF is Kynar. And the reason we use its name brands is because, like Kleenex, often people use their name brands. So we look at bill of materials. Sometimes we see PTFE, but sometimes you see the word Teflon. So we're making sure you're aware of the other terminology: Viton, Teflon, Kynar. That's PTFE and FKM or FFKM or PVDF and so on and so forth. Your lithium battery cathodes, by the way, are PVDF. So they can have it too. Doesn't mean they have to. Fluoropolymers can be made without it. It's just really easy to use PFOA or PFNA to make Teflon. By controlling the concentration of PFOA, you pretty well control the grain size, the precipitation of the PTFE when it's manufactured. Very easy way to control it. That's why PFOA is so useful. So the long chain PFACs under REACH are banned at 25 parts per billion. Medical devices a bit later than normal products. Fluorotelomers and fluoroacrylates are not long chain PFACs, but they can degrade into them according to the guidance paper and rules. So they're regulated at 260 parts per billion. And there's 5 long chain alkyl carboxylates, well, 4 and 1 sulfonate, that are banned under EU MDR. However, it's 1,000 parts per million, which is pretty irrelevant, as these chemicals are trace surfactants, maybe 1 part per million at most for any one of these in a fluoropolymer. PFOA is perfluorooctanoic acid, PFNA is perfluoronoic acid, PFDA is deca, it's 10. APFO is ammonium PFOA. So it's basically a PFOA with the hydrogen. Instead of a hydrogen, it has the ammonium. And this is one of the reasons why you see so many different lists of fluoros, because the salts are, you can put hydrogen on, you can put ammonium on, you can put a potassium on, and so on and so forth. And you do that for each size length, it really adds up. And then PFOS, the sulfonate version. But 1,000 ppm, which is pretty relevant. So you're really looking at the REACH restriction at 25 parts per billion for LC PFACs, PFOA and longer, and 260 parts per billion for fluorotelomers and fluoroacrylates. I know it's a lot to take in. Fortunately, everybody registered will receive a copy of the slides. And they should be recording available online. By the way, at the end, feel free to ask questions in the control panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. This is really technical. I like my chemistry. Not everybody else does. One of the other interesting things about a lot of what we do, because we're the experts on Prop 65. Now, most of our Proposition 65 work is on preventing you from getting into trouble. But if you do get into trouble, talk to us. We've been through it so many times, usually because people didn't come to us originally. We know exactly how to handle it, like to fare thee well. It's the legal part. You always have a lawyer involved, but the legal part. And I have a great story at one point in time. where I was having a discussion with a lawyer and they kept being angry. I was talking about chlorine, but they're like yelling at me that what's listed on the report is C1. Why do you keep talking about chlorine when it's C1? I'm like, oh God, that's an L, that's Cl. So Cl is the element chlorine. Anyways, it was interesting. So there's a different level of knowledge. I'm pretty used to the fact that Cl is chlorine. Not everybody is. It's fair enough. And so when I go deeper chemistry, our Prop 65 work, we did a lot of defense, but we've also really pioneered a lot of the straightforward ways that, or at least built upon what other people have done for exposure testing and making it really straightforward and defensible. But out of that, we got so good at the exposure side, we started getting dragged into the COVID side because there's a lot of exposure scenarios in common. So we actually do a tremendous amount of work for companies, helping them with COVID exposure, both to employees, but I've also worked on a couple of the rapid tests. I've worked on tons of PCRs and many, many protective equipments and know a lot. So if you ever need support, now that COVID, I wouldn't say it's wrapping up right now. For those who are, I'm gonna go back to the chemistry in a second. For those who are interested, Omicron is not a more mild version of Delta or Alpha. It has a different binding site. So what makes Delta and Alpha so dangerous is the cell it likes, the epithelial cell it particularly likes. It likes one up in your nose, and it likes one at the bottom of your alveoli, these little sacs at the bottom of your lungs. And when it binds, it buries under your cell wall, Delta or Alpha, and it replicates. And as it bursts forth, it literally bursts forth through your cell wall and destroys it. Very much like aliens, it leaves behind a husk. And so if it's up in your nose, it's one of the reasons why with Alpha and Delta, especially Alpha, you can lose smell because it bursts forth and destroyed the epithelial in your nose, your smelling cells. But if it does that in the alveoli, the oxygen sacs at the bottom of your lungs, and bursts forth, it destroys the cells that absorb oxygen, and that's why it's very dangerous. What makes Omicron different is it doesn't do that less. What it does, its binding site, it likes your bronchial, your breathing tube. That's why, and it likes your throat. And that's where it binds. And it destroys the tissue in your throat. That's why you often get a cough or sore throat, and you can get congestion, so on and so forth. And it destroys it just as much as it would your lungs. It's just your throat, and it doesn't really hurt anything. You're not going to stop breathing because your throat's sore. And so that's a lot of the difference. And we do a lot of that work to explain why they're different and why the rapid tests work very differently for Omicron because of its different binding site than Delta and Alpha, so on and so forth. So do a tremendous amount of that. But back on to POP. I got to go for a little diversion there. POP has a substance been regulated for a couple of years now, but it's been changed a bit to be at 5 parts per million in articles, physical products. This is Peptochlorophenol. It's a pretty industrial pesticide / preservative. It's a bug killer for outdoor wood and outdoor industrial natural fiber fabric like tarps and such. It's not going to be in clothing. This is, heavily fumigated fabric. It's not restricted to 5 parts per million. You can't really use it for industrial wood or fabric. So unless you're making, outdoor tarps or wrappings for telephone poles, it's really not a problem. But it is banned now in physical products at 5 ppm. So for those of us who are doing testing for us, very soon when we do a POP, it'll be still compliant to POP regulation, the 2019 name convention, updated to the list of December 2020. Everything we do, whether it's regulatory or risk assessment or test reports, everything is tracked not only to the regulation, which do change, but also to what list version. Almost every regulation we work on has a list versioning. ROHS will at some point in time. It's generally been pretty slow about it. But REACH SVHC is every 6 months. Prop 65 is pretty well annual. REACH is whenever they feel like it. It's more driven by Parliament. It's all over the place. POP is generally all over the place. And the Canadian prohibition is being updated momentarily. At same law, but there's new substances. So we keep track of all that. Now, if we're in quarterly updates, we'll explain it all. And this is what it applies to, this is what a product it doesn't apply to. And this, in your product, it's going to be this part of material that's going to be the issue. So that all gets explained. So we do a tremendous amount of lab testing. It's the easiest way to solve anything. And it doesn't matter how you're compliant. If you're compliant, it really doesn't matter how you did it. Testing is a good way to do it. However, if you're ever non-compliant, all they'll ask is whether you have a test report. And a test report, we've been through this on compliances so many times, it basically cures all. We haven't had a negative outcome or a test report. It basically shows you've done the work, where you caught it easily at the time. Human error is rampant. Do you think, your product, you think your supply chain is going to be right 99% of the time with the parts they give you? No? Well, then if you have over 100 parts, you're going to have a non-compliance issue. And a lot of the new chemicals are very difficult. For me, I'm used to it. Though I do have a pet peeve is when I get a list of, one of our customers, here is their customer saying, here are the restricted substances we have restricted in our product, and they do it alphabetically. I'm like, thanks. That's not really helpful. Do it by regulation. And a lot of chemicals have alternative names and so on and so forth, or are not regulated in the way they think of, which makes life a little bit difficult. On average, if you're going to use a restricted substance list, the IPC 1752 type lists are actually generally well thought out. Prop 65 is not as conducive to it, but in general, it's a fairly thought out type list. If you want to actually ask for chemicals, it's a pretty decent way to go about things. Some people put some thought to it, and on average know what they're doing. In the balance of things. So again, quarterly updates, really good. It's probably the best couple $1,000 you'll spend. We'll explain things. You basically get to benefit. We do this for 80 to 100 companies. You get to benefit for everybody's knowledge. The fact that we're not knitting this together for you by some, we're going to let our student knit this together. No. The people who really know the stuff and put the stuff together, really understand the subtleties and ins and outs. And we'll also have all these throw-ins. Here are all the new substances. Here's the risk assessment for each one, whether they'll be in your product, and if so, what materials. And a tremendous amount of value. But because we do it for so much and so regularized, we're a big fan of being more like a factory than a knitting shop. If you're knitting or doing things the first time, we find they're messier, they're prone to error. If you do things repeatedly, consistently, you produce a much better, less error-prone product. So big fan of that. And of course, quarterly updates. It's newer this year. They include risk assessments for here's the new Prop 65 substances, where they're likely to be, what materials, so on and so forth. So really, really useful. And you can ask questions. Sometimes people are like, well, we're being asked a lot about, I don't know, UK REACH. Can you explain that in your next update? Sure. UK stuff in a nutshell, it's pretty easy. It's the European stuff they had at the time of Brexit. And then they will generally do the European updates just longer. And for every single regulation, this is political, and so it's not saying one political party is better or not, it's nothing to do with it, is part of justifying Brexit is they want to say that each one of the regulations, especially on the safety side, is better than the EU's without actually being better. So what the normally does, we're seeing the UK stuff, is of all the, say, imagine Europe regulates, 110 new chemicals. Britain might regulate 50 of them, and then they'll pick one that Europe didn't and point at that one to prove they're stricter. That's actually what's happening for the most part. They'll pick one extra chemical. I was like, oh, you got a PFO limit of 25 parts per billion. We're doing 10. And then that's when they'll justify that the Brexit rules are safer than the European ones. Just the way it is. So again, we do lots of laboratory testing, very much right up to date with most current regulations and list change. Our testings involve a screening and then a deep dive. The screening is the best way to do everything really well without spending lots of money. And with tons of web educationals. We're also general web educationals. Hey, you know what? I like our team to be better educated on recast VHCs or skin. We do that a lot. Or Tosca. That's a fun one. Let your head spin. Well, yeah, it's a fun one to watch your head spin, but we can help with that. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit in the control panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. So your question? Can you expand the lead exemption ending that you mentioned at the beginning? Well, that's covered in your quarterly updates. Well, it is, but I'll actually explain it. So most of the major exemptions are in a renewal cycle right now, and a lot of the main ones, like lead and brass and steel and aluminum, lead and glass and electronics and such, there's a recommendation from the consultant OICO to the EU Commission on what to do with it. In amongst them, most of them are basically unnecessarily complicating things. We're saying, part of the mandate is to narrow the scope of the exemption. So instead of being, say, lead and high temp solder, 7A, it'd be lead and high temp solder in situations A and B and C and D and E and F, which is basically all the uses of it anyways. But by specifying the 6, they're saying it's not as general anymore, and we've narrowed the scope. But in reality, they basically allowed everything that's needed to continue. There are a handful of them, though, that they're changing will have a real difference. And the bigger one is lead in aluminum at 0.4% is changing. Lead in cast aluminum, so molded aluminum, will continue at 0.3%, which is not really a big difference, actually. But machined aluminum, so machined aluminum is CNC machined or rolled or extruded or forged. That's all machined aluminum. They will no longer be allowed roughly by mid-2024. Lead and aluminum. So cast aluminum will be allowed. Lead and aluminum. Machined aluminum will not. Can you talk a little bit about the latest modification to the Prop 65 short form warning? That's also in our quarterly updates. There are 4 basic changes. It's a great read because basically the main warnings were updated in 2018, and that's what we're using right now. And then there's a proposed new change at the start of 2020, which went through a lot of consultation. Inside the text, it's underlined. Then there were more proposed changes in December of last year, went through another consultation, and they're double underlined in the text. And then these are new ones of April this year that are double underlined and bolded in the text. Great fun. One of them is the date, instead of being a year from publication, will go into effect 2 years from publication. You'll be able to use the short or long-term warnings, short or long-form warnings on any product, regardless of size, with no font restrictions, as long as it's clear and can be seen, read, and understood, if it's put on the product packaging or the product itself. So no matter how big or small the product is, if you put it on the product packaging or the product itself, you can use the short or long-form warning, and there are no font restrictions or requirements other than it has to be seen, read, and understood. It'd be easily identifiable. And it has a lot to do with, in the US, you're probably not ready for it yet. You're gonna have a whole bunch of new nutrition warnings and stuff that have big fonts. And if this had the same big font, the products were gonna get exciting. So there's a lot of that going on. But that's all covered in our quarterly stuff. Is DHP restricted under REACH? Yes and no. It's not very helpful. A lot of REACH restrictions are application specific. So the DHP is restricted in about 9 situations with if, then, and buts. So generally it's restricted at 1,000 ppm unless otherwise regulated, say under ROHS or EU MDR, which then that trumps this. So if your product is in a situation where DHP is not regulated whatsoever, it may be regulated under REACH. Medical devices are not, they're excluded. They're governed by their own legislation, it's in there. Toys had it for some time. Regular products are banned, DHP is banned at 1,000 ppm, unless you're, situation A, B, C, or D, or E. There's lots of those, of which anything under ROHS is out of it. Anything that is medical is out of it. There's a strange one where it isn't really well thought out, but basically it's assumed that things that are excluded from ROHS, like large-scale industrial and fixed installation, are also out of scope of the REACH DHP restriction. What is the deal with the upcoming nanomaterials requirements under REACH? So, in my space, in our space, a lot of businesses create a lot of business by creating fear. We don't try to do it by fear, but we do try to actually explain things and try to be useful, but by fear. There are a lot of REACH restriction proposals in the works. People talk about what we're going to do about the PFAS ban under REACH. A, it's not even under REACH. B, it's actually Germany and 4 other governments doing their own survey right now. They're data gathering only. Someday that might turn into a restriction at some point, but it's not right now. Nanomaterials are going to go through some of the same things. There's eventually going to be a variety of proposals going back and forth on how to restrict or otherwise mostly regulate nanomaterials. Because the funny thing is a lot of overlap. A lot of the nanomaterials are being used in nanomaterials because they're biocides, so they're already covered by biocidal regulation. So there's really nothing there at this point in time. People talk about, hey, but the BPA ban. There's no ban under REACH for BPA. There's discussion on it, which has gone back to the drawing board, which will eventually come out with something, but it's not at that point yet. It's still at the, we'll say, public brainstorming phase. So there's a lot of that going on. Should we be concerned with the restrictions roadmap under the chemical strategy for sustainability? Yes, but not quickly. Actually, what's going to, if you're the quarterly updates notice, what's going to really bobble your brain in the next couple of years is going to be the new eco-design regulation. This is taking things and ramping them up a lot more. So if you make an electronic product in the consumer space today, your product may be under scope of some requirement of the eco-design directive. Usually it's like standby modes or power consumption, all energy-based. The new eco-design regulation, which is pretty far along the proposal structure, it's way beyond the brainstorming. It's basically saying, hey, we can now create eco-design regulations for products in by the way, directives, that can do all these different things. They can regulate power consumption, waste, recycled content, repairability. So, by the way, if you make, say, laptops or fridges or whatever, you're already seeing the eco-design regulation in France. Often France implements them first, and then eventually becomes EU. Where if you buy a fridge or a laptop, you'll have a repair index, whereas basically as a manufacturer, you fill in a spreadsheet saying, you know, will they have spare parts for 5 years? Is there a list of spare parts that you can buy? Is it repairable with common tools? Are there software updates available? Can you reinstall the operating system yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And you get a rating out of 10, and you have to put that label on your product, repairability and durability. You'll also have to declare how many precious metals and rare earth metals you have in certain products. And we're seeing that first in France. You'll see at the EU level. It has the ability now creating that you have to provide a REACH SVHC declaration of your product. The SVHC declaration will be on a QR code that goes with your product. By the way, the law creates the ability to create these, but they're not created yet. It's kind of a neat regulation. It's a framework. It says, hey, now based on the new regulation, legally, you can create new requirements to require, you know, SVHC declaration for each product, and it'll have to be available on a QR code, probably a QR code you're skip listing, but it doesn't exist yet. All it says is you can now. So that one is going to really, really move things along. In terms of chemical restriction, other than politics, which can drive certain restrictions, you're really looking at the CORAP process. They evaluate the hazard classification of a substance and determine what risk mitigation measures to do. There's some good comments. Thanks for the updates. I'm a little over time now, so I didn't get to everybody's questions. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for attending. A really good attendance today in both cases. If you have any questions, just reach out. I do recommend the quarterly updates if you don't do them. It's definitely, I wasn't inside the company. That's one thing I would do right off the bat. It's the best way to keep up to speed. You get to talk to an expert who knows the ins and outs, the details of a huge variety of things, and you get to leverage all of our knowledge base instead of what anybody's trying to sell you today for their product. Thanks again, and I look forward to talking to everyone again soon.